you. Well, let's talk now to Chuka Umunna, Labour's Shadow Business Secretary. He's in Manchester, where the party, as we heard, launched its manifesto this morning. So let's begin with what the IFS describes as the big gap in your deficit reduction plans. How much are you going to be borrowing for capital spending?
Well, we're aiming to get the current budget into surplus by the end of the next Parliament. But one really important thing, by the way, Martha, and I just obviously listened to the exchange that you had with Carl there, is that the way you balance the books, the way you reduce your debt and your deficit is not just purely an issue of how much you cut. It's also how much people are earning. The Independent Office for Budget Responsibility was very clear in its December autumn outlook that the reason the government has completely failed to meet its target of balancing the books is because, frankly, your listeners, their wages have been stagnating. Income tax and national insurance receipts have therefore come in lower than what was expected.
Sure.
And of course, the third part of the puzzle is whether you ask the top 1% to make a bit of a bigger contribution to help us deal with the debt and deficit situation.
Okay,
now,
fine.
the
That's
Tories
fine,
generally seek to help the 1% in that respect.
Okay.
We think ultimately they need to, and it's fair to ask them just to make a little bit more of a bigger contribution. So there's a three-pronged approach to reducing your debt and deficit there.
What you've explained very clearly is what you're doing in terms of getting the current deficit down. But what I'm asking you about is the amount of money that you... Exactly. So how much are you going to borrow to finance that?
And let me be absolutely clear in terms of our manifesto today. There are no commitments, I repeat, no commitments, capital or otherwise, that entail additional borrowing. OK, well, let's look at some of the pledges in your manifesto. You say you were going to build more affordable homes by prioritising capital investment for housing. That sounds like some capital spending. But of course, in respect of building more homes, and you're right to raise this as an issue, it's a massive issue. We've got the lowest rate of new build since the 1920s, and we've had a lot to stoke demand by the government, but we haven't had enough done on supply.
So will you be borrowing to spend money on it?
It isn't just an issue of what government spends, it's also what private providers, private developers build as well. And that's why establishing new homes corporations to make sure that we get more private investment into home building, house building is important.
But your own review talks about new homes from housing associations and local authorities being 50,200 new homes. So will you be borrowing to pay for those new houses?
Well, as I said, going back to the overall commitment, and this rule in our manifesto is that there are no commitments that entail additional borrowing, and that, you know, in terms of the question you've just asked, it fits within that. No. I just said the commitment to no additional borrowing in our manifesto, that covers all the commitments in the manifesto cover capital and non-capital. As I said, no commitments in this manifesto published today that entail additional borrowing, and that includes capital.
Includes capital. OK, you've been clear about that. But doesn't that mean that you're not going to be spending any money on capital projects? I mean, at the moment, as we heard from the IFS, the government spends £30 billion on capital spending. So will you be borrowing to finance that £30 billion? Or are you not going to be spending the same amount as the coalition government?
Well, let me just take the first point that you made there. If you run a current budget surplus, then you can spend more on capital without additional borrowing.
But you're not planning to do that until the end of this Parliament. So at the moment, you've got to find money for £30 billion a year if you're going to match the coalition government's own capital spending plans.
Because one important thing that I'm not sure Carl mentioned in your exchange with him, but certainly his colleague, I think Paul, did mention in an interview on one of your sister outlets, is that, of course, part of this depends on the growth in the economy. And in some senses, I sometimes feel when I'm doing these interviews that I'm being asked to spell out what our budget will be in 2018 or 2019.
Well,
and
no, I
don't know what growth in the economy will be. And obviously, if you get more growth, you get higher income tax and corporation tax receipts, which enable investment. So for me to be able to kind of, I mean, as powerful as people may think we are, I can't foresee exactly what is going to happen. And let's not forget, actually, although we do reference, and I suppose our main fiscal council, the Office of Budget Responsibility, their forecasts aren't always correct in terms of what the growth rate of the economy will be.
So your position is Labour,
it's also global.
Just to sum this up, so your position is Labour is not going to be borrowing any money at all for capital spending?
As I said, in the manifesto today, which is our offer
Not
and
just talking
contract
about the
with
manifesto,
people,
I'm talking about generally.
There are no commitments that entail additional borrowing. What you're trying to do, I suppose, and I completely understand it in terms of these exchanges, is try and get me to say to you, oh, well, we're going to borrow lots and lots of money. And the whole point of a manifesto is, first of all, we want to build a fairer and more equal Britain and ensure that your listeners can achieve their aspirations and dreams. But they don't want us to be promising a load of things that are going to cost a load of money, which will make their public finances unsustainable. They want to know that we've got a responsible, properly costed plan. We have that. The Conservatives, who have made almost £20 billion of unfunded commitments, cannot match us in terms of their
let's
our
look
responsibility.
at other parts of Labour's economic
fiscally
policy.
Irresponsible party in Britain
we'll
today.
talk to the Conservatives when they're on the programme, but let's look at debt now, because under your plan, debt's going to continue to rise in cash terms, won't it?
We will get the current budget into surplus by the end of the next Parliament. We will
that's
get
the deficit,
debt falling as
debt.
in terms of debt. We'll get debt falling as a percentage of GDP as soon as possible in the next Parliament. And
but
on
that
the
still means
deficit,
it'll be rising.
to see
We've
it
talked about the
falling
deficit.
year on year.
Let's focus on debt, because it's important. It's a huge amount of money we're talking about. You say that debt's going to be falling as a percentage of GDP, but that means it's still rising in absolute terms, doesn't it?
Well, as I said, where it is by the end of the next Parliament, in part depends on where, the level of growth, what your listeners are earning, the income tax and national insurance and corporation tax receipts in respect of companies, where those things come in. But as I said, we will get debt falling as a percentage of GDP by the end of the next Parliament.
Do you know what public sector net debt is? Do you know what the debt is facing the country at the moment?
In percentage terms, well, look, it's over 80. I believe it's over 75% at the moment.
Yes, so
but the aim is to get it falling.
But you'll be saddling voters with huge interest payments.
Well, the whole reason that we've put so much focus today on having properly costed plans and having no commitments in our manifesto that entail additional borrowing is because we know they want to have confidence that we are going to be able to, and we have plans which have balancing the books in mind if we get into government and we're elected in May.
Well, let's move on to the other side of the equation when it comes to cutting the budget deficit, and that's what you need to be doing in terms of spending. How much do you think spending is going to be cut in unprotected departments? That's excluding health, education and international development.
Well, I can't give you percentage terms for budget cuts over the course of the Parliament, but we have already identified a number of savings and cuts that can be made whilst maintaining the kind of public services people want to see. So, for example, in the Department for Communities and Local Government's budget, my colleague Hilary Benn, the Shadow Community Secretary, has identified £500 million worth of cuts that can be made year on year through efficiency savings. In the police budget, the Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has spelt out how we can save £230 million through doing away with these police and crime commissions. In defence, Vernon Coker has outlined around £60 million worth of cuts that could be made to that budget.
These are tiny amounts. They sound a lot, but they're tiny amounts when we look at what your target is. You've got to cut, at the moment, the current deficit, which is £57 billion. So you're actually going to be having to cut an awful lot more than this, aren't you?
With respect, Martha, what I've just outlined tots up to several £1 billion. That might not be a lot of money to you, but I think to most people in the country that is a lot of money. And look, am I in a position to tell you
I was talking about it in terms of the amount of billions that you've got to cut to reduce the current deficit.
Am I in a position? Well, if just let me finish. What I was going to say is that am I in a position to spell out a full budget for 2019-20 and every financial year between now and then? No, I'm not. I wish I could do that. I'm not Mr. Meg. I can't do that. But what we have done is set out very clear direction of travel, very clear principles, three-pronged approach of getting people's wages up, asking the very wealthy to make a bit more of a contribution, and efficiency savings.
Okay.
We've given examples of all of those things before, frankly, we've even seen all of the government books in full, which Chancellor George Osborne sees in full every day, but when he's asked 18 times how he's going to fund his £20 billion worth of unfunded commitments, can't spell out how he's going to do that.
You've mentioned the tax rises for wealthy people, as you say, and you're planning an increase in corporation tax as well. But what about fuel duty, airport passenger duty, alcohol duties, tobacco duties? Are you committed to not raising them?
But all of those things are things that a Chancellor of an Exchequer announces at a budget. I honestly don't think people want to know what our direction of travel is. They want to know what your core principles are, and they want examples of what you're going to do. We've provided all of those things. In fact, I think, you've been in this game for a while. You're one of the most experienced BBC journalists there is, Martha, and I think you'd say it's a fair thing for me to say that we've put more detail out there in respect of all the things you're asking me about than any opposition looking to go into government in a generation.
Chuka Umunna, Business Secretary, Shadow Business Secretary, thank you for joining us.